Can I please invite you to sit? Thank you. Should I begin? I mean. Okay. Welcome. Welcome. The coffee break was shorter, I understand. We'll have time after. Welcome to our closing plenary. Everything that we live together in these 4 days culminates here. We long to hear the prophetic calls of our 3 distinguished speakers. As a last exception, we want to be very generous. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to summon us. As usual, I will briefly introduce each one of them, all of them together. Now, because of our time limits, we will not have time for questions after their prophetic calls. Our first speaker is Professor Pablo Blanco, professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina, University of Buenos Aires, and the National University of La Plata. He was also director of Latino America, the Journal of Selam, the Consejo Episcopal Latinoamericano, the Latin American Episcopal Council, as we have heard a few minutes ago, from 2011 to 2015. And he is a regional committee member of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church for Latin America. He is a doctoral fellow at the University of Buenos Aires and has a master in social doctrine of the Church from the Pontifical University of Salamanca, and from the University of Buenos Aires, the degree of Magister in Public Administration and degrees in Higher Education and Political Science. His main research interests are at the intersection between moral theology, political theory, and political ethics. Professor Emmanuel Catongole is Professor of Theology and Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, United States of America. He earned a PhD in philosophy and a master's in theological studies from the Catholic University of Leuven. A Catholic priest ordained for the Archdiocese of Kampala, Uganda, Professor Catongole joined the University of Notre Dame in 2012 as a faculty member of both the Kroc Institute for International Studies and the Theology Department. Prior to that, he served as Associate Professor of Theology and World Christianity at Duke University, where he was founding co-director of the Duke Divinity School Center for Reconciliation. He is the author of books on the Christian social imagination, the crisis of faith following the genocide in Rwanda, and Christian approaches to justice, peace, and reconciliation. Among his 9 books, I will mention the last 3 books. Born from Lament, on the theology and politics of hope in Africa, published with Herdmans in 2017. The Journey of Reconciliation, Groaning for a New Creation in Africa, published with Orbis in 2017. And The Sacrifice of Africa, a Political Theology for Africa, published with Herdmans in 2010. Professor Catongole current research is on the issues of identity, belonging, and violence in Africa, part of the Contending Modernities Project, a research and education initiative examining Catholic, Muslim, and secular forces in the modern world. Finally, our third speaker is Professor Linda Hogan, Professor of Ecumenics at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. She just ended her term as co-chair of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, as we all learned at the beginning of our conference. She's the author of 3 books. First, From Women's Experience to Feminist Theology, published with Sheffield Academic Press in 1995, and republished by Bloomsbury in 2016. Second, Confronting the Trust, Conscience in the Catholic Tradition, published with Polis Press in 2000. And third, Keeping Faith with Human Rights, published with Georgetown University Press in 2016, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. Her research focuses on feminist and political ethics. Without further ado, Pablo Blanco.
Estimados colegas, buenas tardes. Dear colleagues, good evening. As you can guess from my voice, I was suffering illness during these days. I want to thank my colleagues, Love and Compassion and Medicines, to be here now. So, well, I will begin with my presentation. My paper title is Rethinking Theological Ethics from a Bridge Building Perspective. It's okay? Do you hear? Yeah. Well, in light of these days, it is clear for me that theological ethics approach to reality should not consider only to extend an ethical view over the world, but to try to find out how much God is present in reality, even if just seminally. On the other hand, the social facts, symbols, or text should be interpreted instead of being objectively described and explained under the signs of the times in a dynamic hermeneutic. The need of a new theological praxis rises clearly, thus bringing together theory and practice in the field of reality, action and contemplation, teaching and studying, pastoral and theology. It is not about theology becoming praxis. It is about a new theological praxis, the possibility of reading praxis in new categories and theological keywords. This new theological reading of reality challenges theologians to go beyond mere theories towards the event of incarnation and to understand the narrative of the people of God from a prophetic view. It would be fitting to remember that in the New Testament we can find 2 ways, at least, of doing theology. We have St. Paul's speculative theology, and then we have the narrative theology of the Gospels. There is a philosophical speculation typical of the Hellenist culture and of Paul, and there is a historical account proper of the biblical tradition. As time went by, theology was systematized and organized in treatises, and Paul's speculative theology turned out to be more determinant than the narrative theology of the Gospels. We learn more about the theology of redemption preached by Paul than about Jesus' testimonial and prophetic presence. Between the speculative and narrative theology, Pope Francis forges a pastoral theological option, what I call a bridge-building theology between them, like Puebla's document calls a pastoral vision of reality, Puebla's Bishop Conference of 1979. Thus, the purpose of theological ethics could be to approach the social historical situation from an understanding made in faith and a prophetic view. As St. John Paul II points out, quote, the theological dimension is needed both for interpreting and solving present-day problems in human society, end of quote. So the challenges for a bridge-building theological ethics are, from my point of view, to address theological places and dimensions, to expose many ongoing actions aimed at transforming reality, many of them peripheral or non-hegemonic, like Yath for Peace, for example, to express the grammar of simplicity by a simple way of teaching, writing, and speaking, and to discover the seeds of the word, evangelical values underlying, that shows God's whispering presence. I will now try to describe briefly 4 theological praises: history, people of God, culture, the poor, and 3 dimensions we can recognize: a Marian dimension, a missionary discipleship dimension, an epistemological dimension. History as a theological place. As said in Medellin, 1968, we are commemorating 50 years of this Latin American Bishops' Conference. People and their communities are inserted in economic, human, historical systems, and institutions crystallize in unfair structures, quotations. What St. John Paul II denounced as, quotation, a world subject to a structure of sin. We have talked about this during this morning. This assertion is reinforced by Pope Francis, quotation, it is the evil crystallized in unjust social structures. We cannot be the basis of hope for a better future. End of quotation. But God shows himself and continues to act for human salvation. The event of incarnation is not a limited and isolated event in history. This Christological settling reminds the Church that is Church in the world, as incarnation reminds that Christ and history become Word. A bridge-building theological ethic commits with a historical fulfillment of the divine plan. In the currents of history, I remember Trento, each person and each community of people can influence and co-influence with God's grace help. The purpose of our Christology is to deconstruct an image of Christ linked to a remote space-time context, to read the signs of his saving presence in all time, and especially today. The people of God as a theological place. The representation of the human being as an isolated individual and the consideration of every subject of study as a disjoint fragment is not consistent to our Christian anthropology that inspires bonds of reciprocal recognition, of shared hopes, and community projects of justice. The signs of the times are distinguishable in the events of the people. Apart from being a geographical reality, there is a community of peoples with its own history, specific values, and similar problems, as we've seen these days, no? A bridge-building theology can recover the Christian proposal of communitarian project of justice and salvation. The ecclesial community is the natural sphere of membership for the people of God, where others are a gift for us, and we are a gift for others in a fraternal relationship. Let's talk about culture as a theological place. The mission of the Church reaches culture because it is the place of all human activity, aiding on its journey in search of truth, and also in the selfless search for peace. The word culture means the relationship with nature among us and with God, as Pope Francis said. Culture is a way of asking about the meaning of the personal existence, an open search for truth and justice, renew it in each generation, and a reflection of how people and society think of themselves and their destiny. Language, history, loving, working, dying, the attitude at the great mystery of God expresses and reflects culture. Popular religiosity expresses a confident clamor for justice, liberation, and redress. and also is a way of fraternity and reciprocity. It is part of the Church's mission to discover in religiosity the secret presence of God. Quotation, the sparkle of the truth illuminating us all, the word's light, present even before incarnation or apostolic preaching. Medellin. Cultural imperialism despises religiosity, particularly popular religiosity, as a sign of identity. It forces acculturation from an attitude of superiority, active or passive. An appealing tale masks a frightening truth. Many Christian values around the world are disappearing due to the overwhelming influence of cultural colonization and globalization. A bridge-building theological ethics must consider that popular culture contains values of faith and solidarity capable of encouraging the development of a more just and believing society, and possesses a particular wisdom and riches which ought to be gratefully acknowledged. We should encourage theologians to discover these valuable roots and set them wings. The poor as a theological place. God shows himself and love, especially those who are forgotten and looked down on. The poor are a place of revelation and conversion for theology and for the Church, but they are also a historical and universal reality. The preferential option for the poor is not just another decision in Christian life. It is what characterizes it. A bridge-building theological ethics should consider their problems and struggles as own, speak for them, but not to quiet the voice of the poor, nor interpreting them, but to denounce injustice and oppression. In the Christian fight against the unworthy condition of the poor people, and also to commit to dialogue with those responsible for this situation. These four theological places matches with three dimensions I have mentioned. The Marian dimension first. It is the feminine dimension of the Church, not hierarchical. It shows a bond of proximity and commitment between the divine presence and the human experience before life and history. Mary's maternal figure sums up the disciple answer of the Church. Pope Francis describes it beautifully. Quotation, "Whenever we look to Mary, we come to believe once again in the revolutionary nature of love and tenderness. In her, we see that humility and tenderness. In her, we see that humility and tenderness are not virtues of the weak, but of the strong, which do not need to treat others poorly in order to feel important themselves." End of quotation. The missionary disciple dimension. The mission does not require a kind of alignment, nor it is a call for a few chosen ones, because those who know and love the Lord need to share with others the joy of being sent, of going to the world to announce Jesus Christ, to make love and service a reality for those who need it most. That's the sign of a bridge-building theological ethics. What is more, faith challenges us to leave our confinement and comfort, to be more fully humans. Faith sets us free from isolation because it takes us to communion. There is no discipleship without communion. Being disciple and being missionary go hand in hand. The discipleship cannot be considered apart from the mission. Being visible is being missionary. The epistemological dimension. As social issues are complex, answers should be considered from a multiple lenses perspective. Historical, memories and forgetfulness, political, structures change, citizen engagement with the public space, economic, financial system, fair trade, social, poverty, gender issues, cultural, interculturality, globalization, ecology, theological, religion and society, faith and reason, among many others. The purpose of addressing the complexity of the social issues is to avoid naturalization, trying to give relevant, timely, and fruitful answers according to a bridge-building epistemological attitude. My final reflections. We are an open learning community which works through cooperation based on dialogue, sharing projects and actions with other colleagues and institutions committed to transformation of reality. Networking is our sign of recognition. We encourage the study, teaching, and researching from a brand new theological ethics, entering into dialogue with culture, communities, and institutions. We believe in bridge-building ethic. It is not a pragmatic ethic guided by the urgency of consensus or convenience, neither utilitarian nor individualistic, that rules out opportunities for deep social transformations. All our efforts have only one destination, the transformation of unjust realities of many brothers and sisters who inhabit our continents. Ideas disconnect from reality lead to idealism and nominalism. As Pope Francis stated, no amount of peace building will be able to last, nor will harmony and happiness be attained in a society that ignores and pushes to the margins or excludes a part of itself. According to our theological experience, proposals always run in a different way in each place and context. But there is something that we believe is essential to all the experience that we appreciate. They are always under the logic of communion and the living presence of Jesus among us. We want to offer an unprecedented answer from the different expressions of the Church. For us, harmony is not uniformity. Unity is not just consensus. Diversity is not chaos, and pluralism is not inconsistency. However, our strength is not only this communion. Each project and action is done with others too. We discover ourselves as brothers, and we invite others to join us. Furthermore, the Holy Spirit that renews all things also renews our vocation for peace and justice under the sign of communion and mercy, to go out to men and women of today and offer them a concrete sign of mercy. Finally, as a conclusion of these days, I would like to raise a humble Sarajevo manifesto as a green balloon that Gustav Kovacs recognized. This message wants to be that green balloon with a message that I wish to touch our minds and hearts. We say no. No to an economy of exclusion and the new idolatry of money. No to a financial system that rules rather than serves. No to the inequality that spawns violence. No to spiritual worldliness. No to surrender at cultural imperialism and the tragic banality of political leadership in too many countries. And we say yes to a new relationship brought by Christ. Yes to safeguard human dignity and creation. Yes, to the challenge of a missionary discipleship and a renewed inculturation of faith. Yes, to the recognition of popular religiosity richness. Yes, to join men and women committed to truth, justice, solidarity, and peace. In summary, we say yes to a bridge building theological ethics. Thank you.
Professor Emmanuel Katongole.
Thank you, Andrea. I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for giving me this opportunity to offer a few closing reflections. In the email inviting me to be on this panel, Christine invited me to reflect and throughout the whole conference to listen so that I would be able to reflect on the spirit of the conference, of what I would have heard in this conference, and at the same time to offer a call to action as we move forward. So I will try to do so under 7 convictions. 7 convictions of an emerging prophetic theological ethics in our time. And I hope you all will be able to recognize a lot of the themes that have been discussed at this conference, at the same time be able to embrace this call to action. So 7 convictions that are emerging. 1, all theology, including theological ethics, is a theology of hope. Our primary and chief task as theologians is to respond to Peter's call in the first letter of St. Peter, chapter 3, verse 15. Always be prepared to give an account of the hope that is in you. That is our task. Peter writes these words to Christians scattered in remote parts of the Roman Empire. Christians cut off from the mainstream and viewed with suspicion and even open hostility. Now, to these beleaguered Christians, Peter invites them to rejoice, even as they are for a while undergoing suffering. The reason for this, Peter reminds them, is because they are God's people, God's new people, who have been called out of darkness into God's wonderful light, and therefore are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people set apart for God's own possession. 1 Peter 2:9. Now, Peter's extortion speaks directly not only to who we are as theologians, but to the context and the goal of our theological task. More specifically, it is a reminder of the tone and style of our theological engagement. For at the end of this reminder, Peter tells them, be willing to give an account of the hope that is in you, then he adds, but do so with gentleness and humility. Our theological engagement must always be characterized by a spirit of joy, rejoice, and must always proceed with gentleness and humility, so as not only to inform, but also to inspire and articulate the hope of the Christian community. Conviction number 1, all theology, our task is to give an account of hope. 2, everything is interconnected, and so the task of bridge making. Our theological task arises out of a cry of lament for our natural, social, and political ecology. Throughout our time at this conference, we have been examining two urgent issues that define our world today: the ecological crisis and its impact on the environment and marginalized populations of the world on the one hand, and the tragic banality of contemporary political leadership. These challenges are deeply interconnected. And as Pope Francis reminds us in Laudato Si, the social and ecological deteriorate together. We are not faced with two separate crises, but one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Therefore, a true ecological approach must also be a true social approach, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Now, this observation highlights the need to make connections in our theology, a theme that has been highlighted over and over again in this conference, to bring together different fields of knowledge, to bring together the different social challenges, but fields of knowledge, economics, theology, political science, but also to bridge different constituencies, the academy, the grassroots, Christians and non-Christians. We find ourselves at a kairos moment where the ecological and political challenges kind of forces us to see that there are many who want to draw wars in our world today between us and them. But this kairos moment is also a moment of opportunity. It offers numerous opportunities for bridge building. Now, this theme has been highlighted by many speakers at this conference. The third, convictions moving forward. An underlying spiritual crisis. Attending to the different challenges that we face today in our world, their interconnectedness points to the underlying spiritual crisis of our world. Again, here, Pope Francis provides a model and a crucial insight. For even as he analyzes the ecological crisis and describes the effects and the rightly critiques the technocratic paradigm that drives it, he rightly points to the spiritual roots of the crisis. At the root of our ecological and social crisis, Pope Francis writes, lies a spiritual crisis, which he also describes as a wound and as a sin. It is the crisis of belonging or the lack of belonging. We have forgotten what it means to belong to the earth and to one another. It is in view of this spiritual crisis that in Laudato Si, Pope Francis calls for ecological conversion and to a new ecological citizenship sustained by different ecological virtues and a new sense of belonging to the earth and to the human community. Similarly for us, our response to the various challenges that we face today must move beyond policy and narrow ethical recommendations or prescriptions. It needs to point to the need to conversion, the change of the imagination, the conversion of heart, the conversion of the imagination, and the cultivation of the relevant values and virtues that arise out of a renewed sense of communion and interconnectedness between God, between the human community and the earth community. In the end, our theological engagement is about a call to conversion. 4, prophetic theology is a critique and a denouncement. And here, Jeremiah, the wailing prophet, provides both a model and a crucial insight. In terms of prophetic critique, for example, Jeremiah's prophetic denunciation was directed especially to 3 areas of public life. First, to political life in general and the institutions of public life, which are built on lies and greed And in this connection, Jeremiah has very sharp words to the leaders who have grown powerful and rich and fat and sleek on the backs of the poor. Second, Jeremiah's harshest criticism are directed to the religious leaders. These are the ones who should know better and expose the unjust and evil social structures and ills. Instead, and quote, the prophets have become wind and the word is not in them, end of quote. They profile falsely, they participate in the social same wicked ways and offer consolations and empty promises of peace and peace where there is no peace, therefore dealing lightly with the wounds of my people. The overall effect of our deteriorating political and religious economy has led also to the worst ecological crisis. And in Jeremiah's time, he points to this. In fact, Jeremiah's own tears seem to be as the first installment of Yahweh's own tears to the destruction of the earth. What does this mean for us? It means that following Jeremiah's example requires both courage and vigilance so as to be able to point out what is broken. What is broken not only out there in the world of politics and economics, but also what is broken right here within the church's own situation. And the more we engage in this self-critique, the more we may find ourselves, not unlike Jeremiah, in that terrible middle between God and our people, between the church we love and serve, and yet whose limitations we point out. The need for courage in this task of prophetic critique. Number 5, our prophetic task is not only one of critique, but also one of announcement, and one of describing a new order, announcing a new covenant, a new future. Again, Jeremiah here provides a good insight and example. For Jeremiah's quote, the prophetic task involves 3 sets of words. See, today I'm appointing you over the nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. What these pairings suggest is that the prophet Jeremiah is called not only to tear down, but also to build and plant, not only to offer warning for the impending destruction, but also hope in the wake of destruction. Therefore, in the last section of Jeremiah, that is called the Book of Consolation, Jeremiah offers promises of healing and visions of return. The prophet promises not only simply restoration, he speaks of a new order when the city will be rebuilt, the once crushed and despised people will be honored, and visions of economic flourishing will fill the city and the countryside. For Jeremiah, the restoration will signal a new covenant which God will make with the people, which will be based on a new knowledge and intimate relationship between God and the people. That is also our task. So Peter's exhortation for us to give an account of hope is an invitation for us into storytelling, to display the simplicity and the elegance, the goodness and the beauty, the ethics and the aesthetics, the ordinary and extraordinary nature of this promise of a new order, of a new covenant in our time. Where, how, when have you seen something of a new covenant, of a new reconciliation, of a new solidarity, or new modes of hospitality that signal this new future, this new covenant? Number 6, an invitation into a new kind of knowledge, into a new kind of theological ethics. Wendell Berry, the American agriculturist and social critic, writes, "We are talking here not just about a kind of knowledge, but knowledge that involves affection, a kind of knowledge that comes with affection, knowledge that is unavailable to the unaffectionate, and that is unavailable to anyone as what is called information. This is in an article entitled, "Out of Your Car, Off Your Horse." What Wendell Berry means by this knowledge is that this is not detached knowledge, but is knowledge as action and advocacy. The kind of knowledge that is born in and through struggle with and on behalf of the poor and marginalized of history. David Tracy is right. All theology is a form of political theology, is a form of engagement. For as he and others note, the suffering in the world, quote, drives the Christian not to further theological speculation, but to the cross and to the memory of the suffering and the struggle by, for, and with others, especially the forgotten and marginalized ones in history, end of quote. Therefore, giving an account of hope is an invitation not into more armchair theological accounts of God, but theological engagement on behalf of and with the crucified peoples of the world. Number 7, we need bold action. The challenges we face are immense and broad. The dignity and lives of millions of people are threatened, as is the very future of our planet. Our playing small does neither serve us nor serve the world. The challenges, therefore, we face call for what Pope Francis calls a bold cultural revolution. And yet, as Wendell Berry suggests, we must learn the discipline of think little, which, according to Wendell Berry, is a commitment to action in concrete and local ways. For as he rightly notes, properly speaking, global thinking is not possible. Unless one is willing to be destructive on a very large scale, one cannot do something except locally in a small place. Thus for Berry, in order to make sense of the planet, you must make ecological good sense locally. I quote, "If you want to keep your local acts from destroying the globe, you must think locally." Thinking and acting locally is what keeps work within the reach of love. That is think little, according to Wendell Berry. But think little is Wangari Maathai, the first African woman Nobel laureate, who started working with local women to plant trees to address the challenges of firewood. Her efforts led not only to a civic movement that eventually brought down Daniel Arapo's Moi dictatorial regime, but her Green Belt movement has to date planted over 51 million trees. Think Little is the Catholic Youth Network for Environmental Sustainability in Action, started by young people in Kenya, now has chapters in 9 countries in Africa, and provides a platform for networking for young people to address the challenges of environmental degradation and climate change. Think Little is Father Bernard Kimvi in the Central African Republic, who welcomes Muslims in his mission compound and hospital during the civil war that pitted Christians against Muslims. Think Little is Josephine Kiza, a woman in Uganda, who with her husband started with 3.5 acres of land and now trains rural communities in the simple theology of integral ecology. Feed the land so that the land can feed you. My dear friends, we are surrounded. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Let us therefore, as the letter to the Hebrews invites us, since we are surrounded, let us therefore strengthen our feeble arms and buckle our trembling knees. Let us be prepared to give an account of hope in our beleaguered word, responding to Peter's exhortation to give an account of hope is a call not only to tell the stories of these many witnesses around the world, stories that give us hope. It is an invitation for us to join them in their marathon, in their struggle, in the revolution of hope. And as Jim would say, let us go forth and walk with moral purpose. Thank you very much.
Professor Linda Hogan.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my fellow panelists for such inspiring presentations. My paper this afternoon is called Vulnerability, an Ethic for a Divided World, with a question mark. So our conversations over these last 4 days have analyzed the immense and growing challenges facing humanity, from populations fleeing violence and poverty to environmental degradation and destruction. And we've also noted with regret and alarm the impoverishment of political discourse, the assault on political institutions, and the absence of political leadership. But our conversations have also highlighted and amplified the modes of protest and resistance, and have celebrated the coalitions of activism, religious and secular, that work towards ethical resolutions of the political, economic, and religious crises that currently engulf our world. In these closing comments, I would like to briefly discuss the nature of the moral challenges we face, particularly in light of the disruption to the fragile moral consensus that had reigned in the post-war period. I will then go on to consider what an ethic grounded in vulnerability might bring to our response to these challenges. And in so doing, I hope to prise open a seam of inquiry about how the bonds based on vulnerability might provide the grounds for a shared future. That is, vulnerability as a way of being, as the ground of our relationality, and as a mode of social engagement, one whose implications are as important for the institutional life of the Church as they are in the cut and thrust of national and international politics. So first, some comments on the political contours of our age. We know, we've heard all weekend, that the international context is beset by a series of unprecedented challenges. Across the globe, we see the rise of practices that assault human dignity and that institutionalize violence. The values of equality, solidarity, and compassion are constantly under threat, and the norms of civic life are in jeopardy. The politics of identity has returned with force, enacting a destructive and contagious dynamic characterized by ethno-nationalist tribalism and racism. The politics of fear is gaining ground, much of it driven by the economic inequalities and the destabilizing changes of post-imperial globalization. And a new intolerance is gaining traction in previously tolerant and democratic societies. This zero-sum political tribalism is magnified and intensified through a toxic masculinity, this is Kate Ward's term, which is on display and lauded among some political leaders across the world, from the United States to the Philippines and Russia. And all the while, the engines of globalization, those multinational corporations of entertainment, technology, banking, and business, those corporations on which we depend and use, have not only shaped economic policy around the world to their own advantage, but they too have now been found to harbor this institutionalized, gender-based violence and misogyny. Nor are the multilateral institutions and NGOs who work to promote social justice and conflict resolution immune from these forms of institutionalized violence. Oxfam, UNICEF, and other justice-oriented institutions, including the UN, have also permitted and ignored the abuse of power, thus undermining much of the important work they do to protect the vulnerable. And as we all know, the Church too has had more than its share of crises as a result of its particular forms of institutionalized violence. That is, violence particularly against children and women, reinforced by an endemic sexism and homophobia, and supported by codes of silence that mistakenly conflate loyalty with integrity. And of course, the everyday sexism that we see on display all of the time in church and church-related organizations, and that we have had to encounter and address and deal with also in this conference. Yet, in the midst of these challenges are the voices and practices of protest and resistance. The moral revolution occasioned by and reflected in the promise that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights is claimed and enacted daily through the social protest and activism in cities, in rural wastelands, in refugee camps all around the world. Moreover, the #MeToo campaign, notwithstanding all of its limitations, has not only revealed the extent of the hidden epidemic of sexual violence, but it has also insisted that time is up for the individuals and institutions who wield their power unethically, or who condone, ignore, or conceal such abuses of power in church and world. Second part, the moral order disrupted. Claiming one's voice, recognizing that every person, every faith, every race, and every creed should enjoy the same right to be heard, and that each person counts for one and no one for more than one, these principles have shaped the normative commitments of the post-war political order and have also influenced, to an extent, the expected norms of organizational and personal behavior in many parts of the world. However, a historical and political analysis of the last 70 years reveals that these normative commitments are honored more in the breach than in the observance, and are oftentimes granted only to those who are like me. Moreover, even while these normative commitments to equal dignity and rights were being formally adopted by governments across the world through the adoption of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the conventions, even as this was happening, the economic policies that would support the realization of social and economic rights were being dismantled and overridden. As Samuel Moyn notes in his recently published Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World, instead of the global justice that was initially bound up with the post-war ideal of human rights, market fundamentalism triumphed, and human rights were cut off from the dream of a globally fair distribution. The problem, therefore, has not just been one of unrealized promises, but rather the abandonment of a fundamental dimension of the human rights agenda, namely the complementary commitment to distributive justice. And therefore, there has been a hollowing out of human rights values by market fundamentalism. Indeed, we see the disquiet and fury that this has engendered in communities across the globe, whose social order has been disrupted and whose livelihoods have been destroyed. The fundamental failing of the post-war human rights-oriented order, therefore, lies in the fact that while it may have left the globe more humane in terms of a formal commitment to equality of dignity and respect, it has also left it enduringly unequal. It's clear that there will be no possibility of a politics in which equal dignity is the preeminent value, unless there's a commitment to address the inequalities and exclusions of globalization, and to challenge the corruption of institutions, public and private, religious and secular, those institutions that wield their power unfairly, because division flourishes in the midst of injustice and exclusion. Yet, even amongst the harshest critics of globalization, including amongst many who have been badly failed by this order, there still remains an inchoate belief, I think, that all human beings as individuals are equal, and that this continues to be held even if it's not always articulated. That this is the case, of course, is an empirical claim, but it is one that has been noted and clarified and claimed and studied by many sociologists and theorists. Indeed, in an interesting recent work by Michael Ignatieff called The Ordinary Virtues, he takes a journey, undertakes a journey which brings him to 10 different countries and to numerous cities, including New York, Los Angeles, South Africa, Fukushima, Japan, Myanmar, Rio de Janeiro, and Bosnia. And throughout the journey, he's asking the question whether in this era of globalization, our values are converging or diverging. And in particular, whether human rights are becoming a global ethic. And his conclusion is actually very ambivalent. He suggests that while human rights language may be the language of states, international law, and liberal elites, the moral language that resonates with most people is that of the everyday virtues of tolerance, forgiveness, trust, and resilience. And moreover, that these tend to privilege the local over the universal, the citizen's claims over those of strangers. Nonetheless, his further engagement in these diverse communities on every continent also reveals that the commitment to equal dignity and respect is still now deeply embedded across the globe, even if in this new moral era, the struggle for equality has produced a clamor, sometimes violent, for recognition and acknowledgement, and that it retreats to loyalty to one's own when threatened. So, the question of an ethic of vulnerability. So the idea of individuals sharing in equality of dignity and rights represents an important evolution in the articulation of our moral commitments, a breakthrough of conscience, if you will. And it persists even when economic forces conspire to undermine it, and when populist leaders agitate against it. It's not surprising, then, that this ideal is sometimes sacrificed for or displaced by local or tribal interests, especially in times of instability, when individuals and communities experience a heightened sense of vulnerability, whether real or imagined. This vulnerability is usually associated with fear and violence, and it often becomes the catalyst for a politics of extremism and exclusion that demarcates the boundaries of community in opposition to other comparably vulnerable individuals and groups. So the question is whether these experiences of loss and vulnerability, which are often marshaled to refute and resist the politics of inclusion and the ideals of a shared future, and which are exploited in the service of dividing communities, whether these experiences can become the creative ground on which a new sense of political community can be established, or to put it another way, can we reimagine the possibility of community, including political community, on the basis of our shared vulnerability? Human beings share an ontology that is grounded in vulnerability. It's tied, of course, to our embodiment, to our vulnerability as embodied agents, our dependency as subjects from infancy to old age. It's connected to the general reciprocity or interconnectedness of social life. And it also accounts for the precariousness of all of our social and political institutions. Despite our differences, Judith Butler argues that it is possible to speak of a we because we have all lost, and because each of us is constituted politically in part because of the social vulnerability of our bodies. So vulnerability, loss, grief inevitably arise from our embodiment and underscore our essential interdependency and relationality. However, vulnerability doesn't stand in opposition to autonomy, but rather it qualifies and reorients it. It qualifies our conceptualizations of and claims to autonomy through recourse to the fundamental sociality of embodied life, the ways in which we are always from the start, and by virtue of our being bodily beings, already given over beyond ourselves, implicated in lives that are not our own. Can this recognition reorient political life? Can it disrupt the dominant political narrative so that the recognition of vulnerability is something that connects rather than divides us? Of course, it's very important not to fetishize vulnerability or to ignore the power relations that are at play in the social and political context that makes recognition possible. Yet despite its challenges, I think it is important to ask whether there is a way as individuals and communities that we might struggle for autonomy while also considering the demands that are imposed on us by living in a world of beings who are, by definition, physically dependent on one another, physically vulnerable to another. So an ethic that takes vulnerability seriously and not as something simply to be ignored or mastered has, I think, the potential to shape a different kind of politics. The modes of relationality constituted through a sense of shared vulnerability are of an altogether different kind than those based on an ontology that seeks to foreclose this aspect of our humanness. Whether this existential experience of vulnerability can be deployed in the service of a politics that unites rather than divides depends on whether it can generate a new kind of conversation about how we act in the world, about our ethical obligations towards each other, about how to oppose the conditions under which some lives are more vulnerable than others, and about how to forge new alliances that are lived in this horizon. So mutual dependence, shared vulnerability, are elements of the human experience that have rarely featured in the ways in which politics is constructed or ethical theories framed. Indeed, much of our politics and ethics seems to be intent on foreclosing this recognition. And yet, these qualities may be precisely those that have a resonance with the individuals and communities worldwide who are struggling to find the grounds for the hope of a shared future in a world divided. We opened our conference in Sarajevo City Hall, a building beautifully rebuilt out of the ashes of war, and with the assistance of the European Union, that fragile and flawed but still standing post-war peace project. So as we take our leave of one another, may we be energized by the relationships we've forged here, and may we continue to advance the mission of CTEWC to appreciate the challenge of pluralism, to dialogue from and beyond local culture, and to interconnect within a world church not dominated solely by a northern paradigm. Thank you.
Professor Pablo Blanco called us to a bridge-building theological ethics. Professor Katongole invited us to a hopeful and bold prophetic theological ethics. And Professor Linda Hogan invited us to reflect critically on our political context in light of an ethical vulnerability that will empower us to be more human and more social. Please join me in thanking them for the prophetic call. We could say that we could start again our conference with their prophetic calls. I invite now our three speakers to please sit, and we want to express our gratitude and our thank you. Please wait us and give us a moment to thank you. Yes. Saji, I invite you to come here with Christine, please. Come here. We are here today because of the work of many among us. Their discreet and faithful dedication deserves our praise. We want to express our gratitude to them. I ask you to hold your applause until each one of us has ended our expression of gratitude. CTEWC helped many of you to obtain your Bosnian visas by mediating with the Bosnian Foreign Ministry. We are very grateful for your patience and competence. The travel agency Zip Viaggi accompanied many of you in flying here. We are very grateful to Paolo Pegoraro and Diana Canale in Padova, and Sabrina Tosato and Enela Cardin, who came here in Sarajevo to help you. They wanted to see your face and hear your voices. It was not enough for them to read your email messages. They continued the work done in the previous month by their colleagues Angela Taffarello and Giovanna Milani. John Quinn and the Italian duo Paul and Gigio graciously welcomed you at the airport from early morning to late night on July 25th and July 26th. Brian Fleming kindly helped John on July 24th when the Indian duo was stranded in the midst of Europe. Yumi Quinn and Gina Wolf very efficiently assisted the planning committee team at the registration desk. Before the beginning of the conference, Victor Carmona very kindly helped us to be ready for the registration process. About the sponsored housing, we are grateful to Goran and the group of seminarians at the seminary. Here at the school, thank you to Father Mario Kozic for being very hospitable, and to Maria Pregernik for accompanying us very attentively in organizing the housing and the whole conference location. And to Sister Antonia and her dedicated staff for welcoming you and for their hospitality. At the Hotel Astragarni, Sanela and Ivanka kindly hosted you. Finally, our conference has been possible because of the many generous donors. Many of our donors are listed in the back of our program. Many more are anonymous. We are very grateful for their generous support. And I want to thank you again, Jim Keenan and Antonio Tiero, for their exceptional work in finding support for our conference here in Sarajevo.
Dear friends, a number of people in Sarajevo have generously helped us in organizing this conference here. If this conference has been a success, we owe a lot to their hard work, goodwill, generosity, and commitment. Some of them are Cardinal Vinko Pulic, who gave us all the support, Darko Tomasevic, who worked day and night to arrange everything for the smooth running of the program, Mayor Abdullah Skaka and his team, coordinated by Belma Simic, who supported us unconditionally and offered us a grand reception on the opening day. Jory Camaros and others who extended to us their helping hands. Zamira Fatma Barugia, Elma Beslik, Emina Frilyak, and Diana Dejanovic of the Youth for Peace for their various assistance and for their inspiring model. You all made our conference and our stay here a great experience of hospitality and friendship. Thanks to you, we have beautiful memories of Sarajevo, this great city, and a great example of bridge building. We also thank Dr. Karsten Dummel and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Elvis Konzig for their generous support. We are grateful to all of you. On behalf of the Planning Committee and all the participants, a big thank you.
And finally, I would like to thank a few groups of people related to the conference program. And again, the plenary speeches and yesterday's homily will be published in a collection by Orbis soon. In addition to all of the paper presenters, whether in plenary or concurrent sessions, I would like to thank all of the volunteer conveners who were willing to help and flex with last-minute changes. Thanks to our 3 tour guides at registration, you all eventually knew how to get to your classrooms. And in addition to all of you who produced dynamic posters, I wish to thank all those who helped make that exhibit possible. Some of you helped us figure out to print on fabric. Some of you offered to produce and pay for and transport posters for others in need. And a team of volunteers met you and mounted them in a really hot gymnasium upon arrival Thursday. For that task, thank you, Steve, Juan Manuel, William, Stephanie, Peter, Chris, Anna, Bill, and David. I would also like to thank by name our volunteer translators for their tireless efforts to make every plenary session accessible. Bjanka Pradalesi, Paul Tang, Anacletus Chukwemeka Nzewihi, see I need them now, Brian Fleming, Luke Murphy, Arturo Balaguer, Michele Mazzeo, and Toussaint Kafahire. And I don't think they're still here, but I'm really grateful to Adnan and Amir in IT who've been helping all weekend. Oh, good, right here. Next, we thank all of you who helped us come together in more prayerful moments. Those who memorialized our departed colleagues on Friday at our service of remembrance, the committees listed in the program who planned our 3 liturgies and peace prayer service, and our last-minute volunteer musicians. I actually think the image in my mind of Lisa Fulham roaming the streets of Sarajevo for a missing guitar string is really apt for accompaniment and accompanist. Next, I'd like to thank 3 religious leaders whose prophetic words and leadership contribute significantly to our time together, Cardinals Supic and Turkson and Dr. Zilka Silyak. In terms of the media, we'd like to single out Joshua McElwee with National Catholic Reporter, Antonio Spadaro from Civiltà Cattolica, James Keane with America, and Jill O'Brien with Orbis for committing to come and spend the entire conference with us. Antonio, we thank you for carrying our letter of gratitude to Pope Francis back with you when you go home. MT Davila has managed and produced all of our social media for the conference, and we are of course grateful too for the tireless photography of Jan Jans as well. Beyond programmatic and financial support, we'd also like to thank all of the family members and communities of support making your participation here possible. I know the conference planning and execution would not have been possible without my own. Moving forward, we are grateful to all those regional leaders who planned and facilitated the 2 continental conversations. The Planning Committee looks forward to discussing all of that feedback from those sessions tomorrow. And now, to conclude, I'd like to invite all the members of the CTEWC Planning Committee to join me on stage. Okay, just to introduce them all to finish, in addition to Shaji and Antonio, thank you for your work over the years and leading up to Sarajevo, to Agnes Brazal, joining Shaji in the Asian region, Emil Sakuda in Latin American region, Sister Ann Aching and Elias Omondiapongo from the African region, Roman Globacar and Antonio Otiero from the European region, and steadying this ship since Padua, and she's not leaving with them, Tony Ross from the United States. And finally, in a minute, I want you to join me in giving a special thanks to our outgoing co-chairs, Linda Hogan and James Keenan. But first, I want to say we look forward to seeing you under the tents for the banquet at 1930. Seating is open, so invite an emerging scholar to join you at your table, invite a cardinal, invite a committee member, invite a journalist, but be kind. And we hope to see you there soon. Thank you all. I said that was beautiful. Thank you so much for your final letter. I am. I wonder if I could. We have 2 hours. I could shoot. Thanks, Ed.
Well, I was shocked when I was going through the timeline.